Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here today. My name is Lily Spira, and I am going to be the chair for this session of the Rethinking Economics Festival. I'm really excited for the panel we have for you today. So today we're going to talk about new developments in tech and AI and social media and just, tech in general, especially because right now there are so many new developments rapidly happening that are being used to connect and empower millions of people. But these same developments also give lots of power to large tech companies and other potential nefarious actors. In what ways will tech help or hinder socioeconomic justice in the near and far future? In what ways is it doing now? We're here today to hear from 4 speakers who will each bring their experience and knowledge to help answer this question, to talk about both the good, the bad, the great, and the worries that tech brings to our societies. Today, what our first speaker is going to be Jessica Breakey. Jessica Breakey is a sociologist working as an associate lecturer in the School of Electrical and Information Engineering at the University of Witwatersrand, where she coordinates a multidisciplinary course called Engineers in Society, teaching final year electrical and information engineers. The course is aimed at connecting social and critical theory to the rapid emergence of new technologies and challenges students to use a sociological lens to examine the roles of race, gender, power, and prejudice in datasets, algorithms, and artificial intelligence. We're also going to be talking to Dalia Gabriel. Dalia Gabriel is a researcher at the London School of Economics, where she is completing a PhD on racial platform capitalism. She is also an associate contributor at Novara Media and a fellow of the RSA. Our third speaker is going to be Jack Gao, a program economist at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. He is interested in international economics, technology, economic development, and the Chinese economy. He has published articles and papers in South China Morning Post, World Economic Forum, Economic Observer, International Economic Review in Chinese, among others. Jack holds an MPA in International Development from Harvard Kennedy School and a BS in Economics from Singapore Management University. The last speaker we're going to have is Navroop Sadev. Navroop is the founder and CEO of the Digital Economist, an impact organization with the mission to drive technological convergence by bringing investable opportunities in line with the Sustainable Economic Development Goals to the forefront. A pioneering economist and technology futurist, Navroop's work lies at the intersection of emerging technologies, economic science, and business strategy. With all that in mind, we have some amazing speakers coming up. So please, if you have any questions, make sure to put it in the Q&A instead of the chat. And yeah, we're going to, like I said, get started with Jessica Breakey.
Thanks, Lily. I just want to check that my sound is fine. All good? Cool. So I think this is one of those panels where I would rather be contributing, to be honest. I was looking at all the bios earlier and I did a little Google, and because, big tech. And I definitely think that, yeah, I was a bit unsure of my role really within this discussion. So I am not a technologist. Really, I'm a sociologist by training, and I got interested in the role of tech and the role of tech in society through a short film that I found on YouTube, or on Vimeo actually, many years ago. It's called Finding for None, and it's it's a three-part trilogy by London-based artists Larry Achapong and David Blandley. Basically, the artistic duo released the series, and it's aimed at exploring, obviously, the writings of Fanon. But the second project in particular explores Fanon's theory of black skins, white masks through a simulated environment of Grand Theft Auto. And I remember just thinking that this was so far out and so cool. And I'd love to read just a very short extract from this film. So the narrator speaks. He says, he knew he didn't belong. He saw through the virtual edifice left behind by the settler, and so he left, seeking a new place of the like-minded, the forward-thinking and the righteous. He fought for his new friends, the right to life. But no matter how hard he pressed against the new machine, he knew he didn't belong. Perhaps he is waiting here, inside the polygons, behind the texture maps, through the fields of algorithms, somewhere in the intersection. And so they continued their unfinished conversation. He asked the other, where are we going? And I think this was just incredibly inspiring for me. And this question of where are we going, with this kind of, with the tech space that we're in, is one that I find incredibly interesting. And the other day I was asked to write a short piece on the role of tech in the public sphere. And I found this a very interesting question, because I feel that to think about the role of big tech in the public sphere suggests a world where it might be possible to imagine big tech as separate from the public sphere. So a world where technological instruments operate as interventions into public life rather than a fundamental part of public life. And I think in 2021, it's not absurd to suggest that we need to move beyond thinking only of the impact of technology and take steps to conceptualize what it means when the public sphere itself is a technological zone. So I would argue, and I argue this in my course, and I'd like to put it forward now, that this intellectual adjustment is an important pushback against kind of decades of holding science and politics as separate entities, which is an inevitable consequence of the colonial university. And I want to argue that the practices that shape techno-scientific infrastructures are social and political and economic and legal. And these global cultural flows facilitated by technology don't simply shape cultural and social life, but are entangled by it. So in the course that I teach, which I think is a very interesting experience in of itself. So I'm a sociologist that is based in the engineering school, and I teach fourth year software engineers to think critically about data sets, algorithms, and AI. And something that has become quite a pet peeve of mine is this kind of, I don't want to say obsession, so I'm going to say fallback, this fallback to ethics. Right, and I'm sure if there are any philosophers in attendance or any kind of philosophers that I speak to will have a problem with this argument, because of course there's huge, broad, literary and philosophical ethics is. But I think in the tech space, ethics becomes an incredibly medicalized tick the box exercise. It's a burden to quickly get out the way. The limits of this approach have been evident in the past few years, which feels like a constant, never-ending development of racist and sexist AI, regression in hard-earned labor rights, and this increasing surveillance. And in fact, there seems to be an entire industry that is focused on discriminatory technology. So shout out Silicon Valley. But this moving from ethics to justice, I think, is really important, because I try to get my students to move beyond this medicalized approach and to think about how you can design technology or techno-scientific instruments for justice, right? And I think that this is an area in both conversation, in literature, in debates that's really limited, right? This conversation is clouded by tech ethics, and I don't feel that we're speaking enough about tech justice, which is why I think this conversation is really important. So, I mean, in the numerous examples of racist algorithms or sexist software protocols, what always surprises me every single time is the shock of the developers, right? So we'll see it like splashed across the Guardian, such and such algorithm or such and such AI is racist or sexist or discriminatory in whatever form, and developers are always shocked. They're surprised, they exclaim that this was never the intended outcome. But big tech companies certainly have ethics protocols, right? And it's even more certain that in these protocols that kind of the discussion on ethics is limited. And I think when this discussion of ethics is limited, the consequence is limiting. And an ethical clearance form that focuses on doing the least amount of damage sees the field, sees society as a neutral space. And I think, I teach my students to see that there is no such thing as a neutral space. And so if you're not kind of designing for justice, if you're just simply designing to mitigate this dangerous space, then I think that the consequences of this are great. And in 2019, there is a sociologist, Mona Sloan, and I really, really like her work on design justice. And this kind of concept is an important framework for analysis, and it's one that allows us to question how did the design of these socio-technical systems influence the distribution of benefits and burdens among specific people, right? So she describes design justice as fighting against the reproduction of challenges of what Patricia Hill Collins calls the matrix of domination. So I think we need to start thinking about this matrix and really understand that if you're not designing for justice, you're just simply perpetuating different injustices. And I think this is what I'd love my takeaway from this chat or this intervention to be is how can we kind of move beyond this really medicalized form of ethics and start to think about designing for justice. And I mean, my job is really difficult, right? Because I just speak to engineers who, I don't know, have opinions about, these kinds of conversations, some better than others. But I always feel like I'm outside the room, right? All I can do is critique what they're doing. But they are the ones that are designing these things. They're the ones that are working with these systems, that are implementing these concepts, and for them to understand that the data that they're using is not neutral, right? Data simply reflects society. And I think the conversation with bias and all these like quick ethics tests you can do online is so limiting because the problem is with the data sets. An unequal society will produce an unequal data set. And if you're not thinking critically about that data set, then you're just perpetuating, the society that already exists. And I think a lot of us can agree that, the society that we exist is not one that we would want to live in. And that is where I'm going to end, Lily.
That was great, Jessica. So many great points made. Definitely, as someone who has worked in the tech ethics field, the difference between ethics and justice is such a crucial differentiation. And I really appreciate you coming out here and talking about that. Definitely have some questions in the chat that we'll get to later. But for now, thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you.
And now we're going to move on to our next speaker, Dalia Gabriel. So Dalia, so excited to hear from you today. For those who don't remember from the beginning, Dalia is a researcher at the London School of Economics. So excited to hear from you today, Dalia.
Thank you so much for having me. And I really enjoyed that last presentation. I'm going to kind of pick up on a couple of things before I go into what I'm talking about. So, I come at this question from a geographic perspective. I'm in a geography department, and I first became interested in technology because I am really interested in work. And I'm interested in work, and I'm interested in the kinds of work that are invisibilized. I'm interested in the kinds of work that are done by marginalized people and how that plays a role in generating economic value. And I was finding that increasingly a lot of the work that is done by marginalized people, particularly in urban centers, is being digitally and technologically facilitated. Obviously, facilitated there is a bit of a problematic term because it's much more than facilitation. But I found myself becoming increasingly interested in how, technology, this thing, especially when it comes to digital platforms, this thing is supposed to be sort of universalizing. It's supposed to be equalizing. It's supposed to free us from the tyranny of geography. And I became interested in how that's actually being made through and alongside places, power, spaces, and bodies. And that actually, this kind of idea of this sort of universalizing touch of technology, particularly in the world of work, in the world of labor, is actually inextricable from issues of power that are very much grounded in material. And, I also, alongside my sort of academic background, I have also an activist background working in sort of trade union organizing, in other kinds of decolonizing and anti-racist organizing. And it was only when I came into the technology space that I started to hear things being conceptualized as, ethics and fairness and bias. And I was very curious as to why things that in other remits and in other disciplines and in other spheres of activity are called exploitation, power, injustice, oppression, systematic oppression, when it comes into the tech sphere, suddenly become they become spoken of in language, the language of optimization, right? The language of operations, these kind of much more anemic definitions and I think it's really interesting to think about why that exists in the tech space. What is it about the political economy of the tech industry? What is it about the places where the tech industry is being sort of developed, where it is located, both economically, spatially, politically, that leads these questions to be metabolized into these ideas of ethics and fairness, and what that means. I think that in many ways, the question of, how do we make tech for justice actually we often ask that question too late in the process. I think that what we need to start doing is actually thinking before we're even getting to the point where we're designing a technology, thinking about what is this technology actually doing? Who is designing this technology and for what purpose? In my main case studies, where I look at Uber and I look at Bubble, so Uber is a minicab sort of taxi app that I'm sure everyone is familiar with. Bubble is a babysitting and nannying app. I would say that in those two instances, you have an issue whereby the technology is designed in order to the purpose of the technology, that the sort of raison d'etre, before we even get to the state of, data and design and deployment. The actual objective is to sort of squeeze every calorie and every minute and every dime out of workers while trimming labor costs to the absolute lowest. And that is what is constantly being, that is the process that is being automated and the process that is being deployed, which is why, despite, heroic attempts at strategic litigation and, impact, trying to kind of do organizing around it, we seem to not be able to really make considerable shifts. And I think it's because of a problem of ownership, and a problem of direction, rather than that's before we even get to the question of data and design and deployment. So essentially, the growth of the platform economy, which I argue is sort of the intersection of, the digital economy, digital work, and the gig economy. Both of these things predate the platform economy. Gig work especially, this is a form of work where people don't have a sort of salary or a wage, rather their work is broken down into tasks, and some of them are compensated, some of them are not. This has always existed at the fringes of our economy. It's the kind of work style that has been undertaken by sex workers, by carers, by basic babysitters, etc. But when this kind of meets with algorithmic work and meets with sort of digital work, we have, the big platforms, the Ubers, the Bubbles, the TaskRabbits, and these are all examples of the kind of work that I'm interested in. And I think that the growth of this form of work has thrown up a myriad of challenges to existing frameworks surrounding work and employment. Most significantly, the business model of these companies relies on the legal and cultural assumption that being a Deliveroo rider, being an Uber Eats courier, is not in fact work, or at least it's up to the platform to decide what part of the task is work and therefore what it compensates. So even though we've had the Supreme Court ruling in the UK, we've had difficulty actually implementing that ruling. But it's interesting that Uber accepted in principle, although it's kind of questionable, some parts of the ruling, but the part that Uber is really pushing back against is the ruling that all of the time plugged into the app should be considered working time and therefore waged, because driving around the city looking for jobs costs the driver money through fuel costs and congestion charge and various, charges that we have in this city to use the roads. And also it's essential to the promise of on-demand labor that is made by the app through providing basically an abundance of drivers spread across the city who are available on demand. One of the biggest babysitter apps on the market, CoroKids, talks about care labor done by its nannies and babysitters as a job that doesn't feel like work. So almost all these platforms are invested in their reputation as technological intermediaries rather than as agents in the labor relation. And the self-identification of platforms as providers of technology services rather than employers is a hallmark of how these platforms operate. Even after the Uber ruling, and it's important to point out that Uber is not the entire platform economy. The platform economy is much bigger than Uber, but Uber is kind of the poster child. But even after this ruling, the denial of an employment relation is codified in platform contracts signed by workers, in which both the users of the app and the workers on the app are legally categorized as consumers of the app's digital services. And so that erasure of labor dynamics bleeds into the cultural framework surrounding the platform economy. And it has profound material implications on workers because it essentially it's an instance where technology has represented the logical end of the neoliberalization of work, where workers are trapped in a kind of worst of both worlds model, where like a traditional employee, they generate value for platform companies and they are dependent upon the platforms for work. But by not being legally or culturally recognized as employees, they are not entitled to traditional employee provisions. And by extracting itself from the employment relation, platform companies are able to circumvent hard-won labor regulations, such as those surrounding unfair dismissal. But that's not new. This kind of Fordist model of employment where workers can rely on a job for life with comprehensive employee provisions has only ever been accessible to a tiny portion of the world's workforce. And that's been stratified along the lines of race and gender and nationality and migration. So we shouldn't understand platformization as a radical departure, but rather as an expansion of labor norms that have historically existed at the social margins. For example, domestic labor has always been devalued because it is understood as something other than work, despite its centrality in generating value. So it's therefore unsurprising that platformization has had particularly transformative impact in labor sectors traditionally dominated by those marginalized workers, such as minicab work, domestic work, and sex work. And so that context, and I'll wrap up soon because I think my time is probably coming to a close. So that context is really crucial when considering how trade unions and workers can be protected from a platformized economy. It's not just about sort of these it's not just about things that we traditionally consider to be employment issues, things like, wages, things like working time, things like pensions. But we also need an approach that really looks at the varying social and political factors that devalue those who do platform work, both as workers and as human beings. So this includes, hostile immigration policy that pushes migrant workers out of formalized labor forces and reduces their access to public funds and infrastructures. This, creates a highly exploitable, precarious, and very cautious workforce. And it's a workforce that will then struggle to push back when platform companies encroach on the labor rights that they have left. And that wholesale degradation of labor rights has always historically been started by affecting workers at the social margins, and then it expands until it becomes the norm for vast swathes of the workforce. So if platformization is the future of work, then all workers, whether citizened or not, are staked in the improvement of the conditions for migrant platform workers. And so that's why we need to conceptualize this, yes, as traditional employment kind of struggle, and to really conceptualize this as a work struggle, even though these workers aren't necessarily considered workers. They don't have a centralized workplace. They don't have cohesive understandings of working time. But as well as working to incorporate our understanding of platform struggles into the worker struggle, or into workers' rights, we also need to think about the holistic and exclusionary practices that create those at the social margins, against whom these sort of new technologies are essentially being experimented against and experimented on. And the boundaries and the dehumanization that is necessary to a lot of these models is being sort of tested on workers who are, socially and politically and economically marginalized through other ways. So the platform workers' struggle has to also be one that is an anti-racist struggle. It has to be a struggle that is against vicious migration regimes. And it also has to be a struggle that is, gendered, that is feminist, because a lot of platform workers are women, despite the over-focus on Uber. And it also has to be one rooted in disability justice, as people who are excluded from traditional labor markets because of disability are increasingly having to turn towards these sorts of forms of work and are experiencing very harsh working conditions as a result. So yeah, I will stop there. I've probably gone way over my time, so I'm really sorry about that.
No, all good, Dahlia. I really enjoyed listening to you. A lot of what you said, it reminded me of Proposition 22, which is something that passed in California last year, which was this proposition that disguised itself as something to benefit gig workers, but actually worked to circumvent the responsibility of the apps that they worked on. And a lot of gig workers worked really hard to try to not get it passed, but it unfortunately did get passed. It reminds me about how Patreon originally started off as what we think of now as OnlyFans. And Patreon originally a platform that hosted a lot of sex workers, and now it's moved to OnlyFans, and now OnlyFans is also starting to exclude the sex workers that gave them their platform. And it also reminds me that we have a great other theme going on during this festival, which is hidden economies. So make sure that if you are interested in that, make sure to check out some sessions that are related to hidden economies. So thank you so much, Dahlia. Really insightful. And I can't wait to circle back with some of the Q&As. So next, I'm really excited that we're going to be talking to Jack Gao. Jack Gao, as I said earlier, is a program economist at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. So Jack, really excited to hear from you today and hear what you have to say within this discussion of, the intersection of technology and socioeconomic justice. Jack?
Hi, Jack. You able to turn your video and mic on, which will be at the bottom of your screen? If you full screen, it should come up. Great.
Oh, perfect. There we go. Hi, Jack. So lovely to see you.
Sorry about this tech glitch. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I see you, I hear you, I recognize your presence, your existence, and really excited to hear from you today.
All right, very sorry about that. Let me thank Lawrence, Thijs, and the organizers for inviting me. And also let me take the opportunity to really salute Rethinking Economics and congratulate on this Rethinking Festival. If let's say the dismal science were to have a festival, it is only appropriate to have a rethought. I'm going to try to be a little cheeky and take a different turn from the previous two speakers, which I really enjoyed, Jessica and Dahlia, coming from your vantage point. I will talk through us with some quotes. They're not quotes of my own. You may recognize some or all the quotes, so bear with me. And they're meant to really capture the techno ethos of our era and the economic ramifications. Given the format, my logic wouldn't be really watertight, but hope to at least provide some color. So the first quote, which many of you know, is you can see the computer age everywhere but in the productivity statistics. This is by Nobel laureate Bob Solow. I think in late last century. It's sometimes dubbed the Solow paradox. And it really has so much wrapped into it. First of all, it's a measurement issue. Not yet in the digital economy proper, but already in the, let's say, the previous economy where computers are starting to become the mainstay of our tools, of our toolkit. The economy was already changing back then, let's say several decades ago, and the onset of digital economy has really turbocharged that, which I'll touch upon later. The second thing that's wrapped into Solow's quote is, with neoliberalism, globalization, technology writ large, we've seen the great divergence. Many of you know this. We've seen the great divergence from the late 70s, even with a slower productivity growth. That is the divergence between productivity and wage. Kind of the median wage hasn't grown that much since the late 70s, but the productivity sort of continued its trend. This was first popularized, I think, by the Economic Policy Institute. The third thing about Solow's quote is that if computer age was mysterious, when it comes to its interaction with technology, with productivity, the mobile internet of things, 5G, platformization, many of the things that we're talking about are even more so. The transactions are not straightforward. If you're taking Econ 101 now, you're having a hard time relating the kind of face-to-face, one-off, sometimes repeated transactions with the economy we're living in, where the role of prices don't play that much of an important, if crucial, role there. And number four thing about Solow's quote is that if it remains to be seen if we're really going to have a roaring 20s, as some people talk about, but it would be nothing too much to look forward to if it is a roaring 20s accompanied by increasing automation and worker displacement. Robert Gordon recently, I think on Wall Street Journal, talked about his renewed phase about increased productivity growth in the coming decade. But his premise was based upon less workers, some of them displaced by automation and e-commerce. And as a result, each worker that remains in the labor force has a higher productivity. I don't think any of us would see that eventuality. So that's the first quote by Bob Solow. Kind of paints the picture, but let's say it was mostly about the last era. The second quote, we wanted flying cars, instead we got 140 characters, attributed to Peter Thiel. Many of us are kind of familiar with this quote. I think it reflects sometimes the lamenting about social media, about screen everywhere these days. If Elon Musk is somebody's idea of a hero or a model, I think partly it's because he's kind of making things in the physical space, sending stuff into space and that kind of stuff. I'm not passing value judgment there, but I do take note of that difference. I also don't want to take sides on this advancements in virtual versus physical world, but I think one thing we should learn from this quote is that at least it makes us think that the tech trajectory is not predetermined. I think the previous speaker have hinted on this. There are conscious decisions and investments, sizable investments, made at every step of the way. We know that many of these things that make the current technology possible, internet, GPS, it's to do with government, sometimes military investments early on, but they were used in quite selected ways. Let me give you an example. When you think about China, one of the things you think about is surveillance cameras. Some people talk about surveillance state and all that kind of stuff. You drive across the road in China, you see lots of cameras. But even with that kind of investments, if you were unfortunate to depart with your child, to lose your child anywhere, the chance of finding your child is 0.1%. With that kind of ID registration, the hukou or household registration and facial recognition technology, that's how low the chances. I think I don't want to make sort of hasty judgment. I think there are difficulties there, but I don't think you will get numbers that low if these technologies are used to that end. Number three, I think whether or not which direction of technology we go partly depends on nations, depends on what our governments define the race to be, which is what kind of the US is doing with China and vice versa, and together with some other nations, the other party is going to eat our lunch if we don't do such and such. Sometimes they're sold to our electorate that way. Also, it's partly to do with, I think Dahlia mentioned this very well, it's to do with the techno-entrepreneurial ethos of our time. There's the Valley, of course. There are investors, venture capital investors, who have tasted, let's say some of the easy profit made by the early platformization, and they kind of go around the world hunting for similar deals and really replicate the model, given its increasing return to scale, given its, given the kind of anti-competitive, let me say this loosely, anti-competitive properties that's kind of built into the business model. That's the second quote from Peter Thiel I wanted to use. The third quote, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. It's another kind of cliche saying in mostly the Valley these days. It is unfortunately the predominant business model. We have all been recruited as part of the product, sometimes without our knowledge. It says a lot about how data is collected, what kind of data is collected, who controls the use of our data, and who reaps the benefits. We hear some people proposing data dividend and such. All these decisions are made, like I said, without our knowledge most of the time, and certainly without our consent. We have an economy with a sizable chunk of it that runs on data and runs also on our attention, which is the new scarce resource. Here I have in mind the book by Tim Wu, the former Columbia professor who's now a special assistant, I think, to President Biden on tech and competition. Early on, he wrote this book, Attention Merchants, the epic scramble to get inside our heads. Kind of a scary title, but he was only talking about mostly newspapers, radio, TV, and such things, not even into the digital economy part. And all of us have many roles. As consumers, sometimes we feel well empowered, let's say, in some cases, and convenient in this economy. Not conclusively, of course. As workers, there is what is called a productive dichotomy. If you're in the right side of the economy, you've seen your real wages grow. If you're, let's say, in the wrong sector of the economy, your life just became miserable. As citizens, we feel disempowered and sometimes manipulated. That's a second quote, which leads me to, that's a third quote, leads me to the fourth quote. The best minds of my generation are thinking about how to make people click ads. This is by Jeff Hammerbacher. Also, it was said in the early 2000s, still holds very much true today, I think, although we're kind of in a new generation. But the kind of thinking about making people click ads only got more sophisticated. I'm sure a lot of memes, a lot of Twitter and other memes come to mind, people eavesdropping what we're gonna buy. It says a lot about misallocation of resources or talent. Reminds you a little bit of Wall Street, doesn't it? It says a lot about elite capture. Try to talk to your friends at Facebook about this. Probably not going to have a very constructive conversation there. In the political economy lingo, it's to do with the ideas and interests bit. Interests, of course, they're anti-salient, like that friend who works in Facebook. For ideas, for bright college students, Jessica, you probably have many of such students. They're looking for the best job on offer, and usually the kind of criteria they judge that is you look at the highest paid job. Most of the time, it's the only criteria if you're kind of looking for a job, coupled with some grandiose social objective. We're going to disrupt this, disruptive that, democratize this, democratize that. And as a result, there's elite discreditation going on, the revolt against the elites that we're observing so commonly. Of course, these kind of connections I'm drawing won't pass your econometric tests, but what I'm doing is I'm trying to paint a picture here for you. Last quote I will use today, we shape our tools and then our tools shape us. This is usually said about buildings by Winston Churchill, but people like Sherry Turkle and others have kind of modified that. I think it's a really nice quote. If we think about how we spend time these days, how we go about our business, technology really has a profound role, has changed our economy and society. I don't have to repeat this. In hindsight, you can argue, given how much has changed, we were probably in a hurry to make decisions, or too much thought was put into its development and deployment. Certainly, recently there's some, with let's call it loosely the end of Biden, the end of freedomonomics or the end of neoliberalism. There are some encouraging signs. G20 tax deal to start with. We've seen both in the US and China some crackdown on platforms or promoting competition. In the case of EU, much earlier in terms of data. And if 2010s was the period of unbridled embracement of technology, my personal wish is 2020s is at least going to be more controlled, more nuanced, more careful mode of existence between us and technology. If we're really going to have our roaring 20s, in the sense of the word, of the term 100 years ago, broadly shared prosperity powered by technology advancement, I think these social considerations have to be put front and center. So that's the end of my intervention.
Jack, thank you so much for so many incredible thoughts deriving from those quotes. And really, I mean, you couldn't have crafted a better introduction to our next speaker because Navroop is the founder and CEO of the Digital Economist, which is trying to drive technological convergence by bringing investable opportunities in line with these global sustainable development goals. So Jack, thank you for your thoughts. And also thank you for that wonderful introduction to our next speaker. That'll ended up working out great. Yeah, so like I said, now we have Navroop. Really excited to hear from you today. And yeah, thank you so much for coming. Super excited to hear what you have.
Thank you so much, Lily. And you are absolutely right. I have been mind blown with just the amazing insights that the speakers previously just about before me talked about. I'm sorry, it's still my morning, so I'm sipping my coffee. And working in the industry, I would say that it's such a soulful conversation for me, and just so thought-provoking, and just really offering that reflective space that's kind of often missing. With Jack pointed out too, because a lot of the focus of the industry is to make money, right? But what I thought I'd do, and just hats off to Dahlia and Jessica. Sharing those insights with us. And what I will do today is just give a little bit sense to our audiences where I'm coming from and why I do what I do. And I think with that, there's a lot in terms of where options probably are available to Jack's point, to current students of economics, right? And so I think that probably is, I guess, hopefully my biggest contribution today. Let's take a step back. Just as Campbell talked about the hero's journey, right? How all religions, how all the philosophies, mythologies in the world have that same heroic sort of like cyclical structure of having a call to action, kind of tackling the crisis, and then battling with the demons or the dragon, the big sort of climax, and then sort of achieving the goal the hero set out, which I'm using in a gender neutral way, and come back with the gifts and bring it to the world. So I want you to think a little bit about that structure of life, and there are many parallel heroes' journeys we are on at any given time. We have a crisis in the world. We kind of recognize that, but I think it's interesting to examine on who are the people who respond to those crises, and who are the ones who just turn a blind eye, right? And I think that is the question that we need to ask ourselves. Questions that students, questions that all of us at any given time should be relentlessly asking, right? So just take a step back. My name is Navroop Sadev. I'm born and raised in India, and I lived there for the first 22 years of my life. And it's relevant to mention that here is because I saw poverty and inequality at very close quarters, right? Like you cannot escape that in India. So I come from a middle-class family. We never had any international vacations or anything like that, but we were okay. I got good education. My mother was well educated, And so I was very fortunate that she was like, they're going to go to the best school, and then that's that about it. And my life would have taken a very different trajectory had it not been for those sort of decisions along the way, what is called path dependency in economics as well. So what I intend to do is, using the structure of my life, also share a little bit of, how I applied economics in my life and why that's relevant to you, right? And so I used to have this dream of, oh, I hope there's a magic wand. I could like take away the suffering of all the people around the world. And why do things have to be this way? Like, why could we just like not give things to, those who don't have enough? And I mean, I'm talking about disabled people, or like kids crawling in trains in dirt, begging for food, begging for a few pennies, right? And that's the sort of apathy that's present. I mean, the US is a very different mental state because there's that individualism. Like, you just don't see the pain and the suffering, right? You just see like this kind of New York high where you feel like everything's possible. Like, the second I fly out of India, my mood changes, like when I visit my family, for example. But let's just take a step back here for a second. So I finished my master's degree in mathematical economics and advanced econometrics and all that jazz in India. And I moved to Europe, and I pursued another dual degree program. And I think that was the first time that I learned about rethinking economics in Italy and France. And I squeezed a little internship at the UN Environment Program between the two academic years. And it's funny because when I first heard about the organization, my colleagues were rallying for how this, pluralist approach is necessary in economics. And I thought that was bizarre because, like, what does that even mean? And then I learned, and it's still the case to date, that the way economics is taught in the West, at least Europe and US, or perhaps to some degree Canada too, is just one school of thinking. And that's shocking. It's like creating a cult. There's only one way to think, and that's ridiculous. I mean, I'm still shocked to this day. And every time I talk about this, it's just, it's bizarre because in India, you study all schools of thought, even though the syllabus is just really old. Like, you're not really getting any job market skills, to be honest with you. And so I didn't feel ready for a PhD, and I didn't feel ready for the job market. And I was like, I'm going to do another master's, I guess. So that's what happened. And, they were sort of like talking about this at the campus at University of Torino in Italy. And I was kind of watching on the sidelines, and, fast forward 6-7 years, here we are today. And that is something that stuck with me. Another thing that I learned during that time of being a student in Europe is this notion of financial globalization that Jack hinted at as well. And it's not just important at the individual level, like ABC firm, the Silicon Valley, the US government. It's true globally. And that reminded me of Arundhati Roy, who wrote this book called The Shape of the Beast, which was shocking for me. She's a contrarian, probably one of the biggest inspirations for me, but one of the boldest voices coming from India, right? And again, India is a country of contrast. We have a country where the role of women is so marginalized, right? I mean, they barely have any rights, right? It's like often ranked as one of the worst countries in the world, like right after Afghanistan or Pakistan, like number 4 or something. And that those numbers have stuck with me, probably change over the years. But and on the other hand, you have these remarkable female leaders, fierce women who are changing the world because those situations create those heroes, right? Under extraordinary pressure, diamonds are born. And so with that financial globalization, I just want to reinforce what Jack talked about, which is the pace, the direction, and the flavor or the variety, if you may, of capitalism is not something that's a given. It's not a, coming from the blue. It's not defined by God or whatever you believe in, right? Yeah, it's people making decisions, and you probably wouldn't hear about it because you're not part of those private circles. So as students, as teachers, researchers in economics, we also always need to think about, what at the system level is happening for us to be kind of living in the world that we do. And it's really shocking when you see how decisions of a few affect so many of us at scale. Literally the direction of the planet, and that's not even funny anymore, right? And so that's one. The other thing that I learned during my master's program, my second and my third master's, is complexity science. And I would sit at the first bench, and I always have been all my life, and just learned everything I could, wide-eyed, and asked all sorts of questions, and did my thesis work on that at Harvard Kennedy with Ricardo Hausmann eventually. And it changed my entire paradigm, right? Definitely of my professional life. But then I also started to see more links, the more dots I could connect. For example, complexity science is sort of coming from the 1950s work on, a whole bunch of other disciplines, and of course revolutionized all of the social and the kind of natural sciences in many ways, and the way we do science. But interestingly enough, and that's food for thought for our audiences today, the Vedas from 5,000 years ago also talk about a systems approach, a wholesome, approach to looking at everything. I'm not talking about let's all be one, and love is all there is. I'm not talking about that, but I'm talking about the way you see reality, the very fabric of reality, right? And that's not trivial, right? And so the more I learned about quantum, and it just all started to make sense. And a couple of years ago, I had a little bit of an epiphany, which is when I started the Digital Economist, about kind of bringing it back to the current day. I see myself as belonging to a small group of rogue hippie economists who said, well, I'm not gonna, analyze the world as it stands. I'm gonna roll up my sleeves and build the world that I want to see. And I'm very proud of saying that, because it's not an easy journey. And I do things that, economists don't do, because it's part of running a company, an ecosystem, right? And so, there's this elite attitude as well in the profession, which is only hurting it, that I think we can get rid of, right? That's my first learning. For me, I published my thesis work in, Palgrave, that acquired by Nature. So my thesis work is sitting on Nature, and I'm like, well, you know what? Whatever I had to indicate, I indicated. Whatever I had to signal the quality and the pedigree to the market, I did. So let's move on. Let's do something that's impactful. It's funny because I don't talk about this a lot, but I almost had an existential crisis when I was at the Kennedy School. Nothing wrong with the Kennedy School, amazing place to be. It's remarkable. But because internally I was thinking, well, am I just going to be writing papers, doing derivative work, and write in a language so complex that only those who are trained to understand it, read it, get what I'm talking about? Or do I want to do something different in my life, at 25 years old? And I decided it was definitely the latter. It's so important for me to continue to feed my mind, and that's why the conversations today, it was just remarkable. And what we do is also very knowledge intensive, right? The Digital Economist is a body of experts. We have, what we do is a lot of advisory services, talking to firms and organizations and other stakeholders and governments, say, okay, here's how you can build a human-centered world, right? And that's the mission of the company. Lily, what you picked up is the initial statement we had on the mission statement of the organization when we launched on the World Economic Forum. And that was also a statement for us. We are contrarians in the sense, and we went right at the heart of the global economic order, and we made a statement there, right? We hosted 300 CXOs. We set the agenda to build a human-centered world. We said, stakeholder capitalism is not enough because you keep perpetuating what has already been the case. And then, of course, Dahlia and Jessica talked about it very well in vocabulary that I'm realizing I need to update my vocabulary because I don't even have this vocabulary that they beautifully put all these things in, because I've been so focused over the past 2 years in sort of building the world that I want to see. I mean, industry is far behind. Right now, the greatest tooling currently is like ESG accounting systems, right? While academia is talking about ethics and social justice and how we need to look at things differently, and it's no longer just about tech or the functionality you're providing and the problem you're solving, right? But most of the technologies simply do not have the training that we do as students of economics, right? And there is no such thing as neutral economics either. Let me just say that. And so, if you're studying whatever theories you're studying, it's training you in a certain way, right? David Bohm has a book called Wholeness and the Implicate Order. I never went past the first chapter because there's so much wisdom in it. I just keep rereading the introduction in chapter 1, which is, if you look at the world in a fragmented way, you will perpetuate that same fragmentation in what you build in the real world, because humans are the only species that can actually hold imagination, crystallize it, and actually build the world around us, right? Other animals, other species are not able to do that. They are also intelligent. They also have conscious, and they're but at the same time they could use tools, but they cannot do what humans can do. And so this broken, fragmented paradigm is perpetuated over and over and over again, right? So now appreciate the whole thing about pluralistic economics, heterodox economics, although I don't feel it's enough. There's almost an integration of sciences that's needed for that wholesomeness to come about. And that's helpful to anything in life. You want to become a wholesome person. There's really nothing, for me, glamorous about being called an economist. And the reason for that is it comes with a lot of this baggage, right? In my last job, crazy story, last full-time job before I launched the Digital Economist, I think I was kind of expected to do some spreadsheet sort of number crunching as an economist, and finance was not my sort of domain, and then I'm not an accountant. So that tells you a lot about sort of where things stand to a great degree. And of course, Amazon, for example, has 1,000 or so economists working for them, running regression analysis and optimizing supply chains. And I have a lot to say about that and what happened with that, right? Given the pandemic. But I know I'm taking a lot of time. There's so much to talk about and say to our audiences here. But I think the one key message that I want to leave with is that you can build the world that you want to see, and there's no one else, to do it except you. And so you need to be brave. It doesn't matter what you're trained in, and it doesn't matter what you learned. Don't get tied up in endowment effect. Don't get sunk into, oh, this is what I did, so that's what I must do. And you will curtail all the opportunities and the potentialities and all the versions of you that you could have become if you do that. And this is almost a responsibility, because you cannot keep perpetuating what you inherited. You're not building a better world if you do that, right? So my call to action is to be brave. We have an enormous advantage as economists, because we understand the way the world goes round, behaviorally motivated, but I should say economically motivated, but tied to behavioral constraints. So I would encourage everyone to read, to explore, to talk to scientists, and talk to technologists and everyone and anywhere you go, and refine and subtle way to your paradigm of the world, and find alliances and build alliances, which is what I do a lot. Who are my allies? Who are the people who are on board on this mission? Like, I don't have time to talk about ideas. I want to build the world that I want to see. Life is short. And so let me leave it there. And I am very open to questions and discussions. Or back to you, Lily.
Thank you so much. Thank you for taking us on that journey, giving us your proverbial gift from your own hero's journey. And certainly, as someone who is born and raised in the United States, I remember in high school being taught neoliberalism as the gospel truth of the world. So certainly a lot to work on in terms of diversity of thought being taught. Now, before we go to our Q&A questions, I first want to know if any of the speakers have questions for our other speakers, and if all of our speakers wouldn't mind turning on their cameras and their mics, just so we can all see you as we start to enter these questions. But yeah, I would love to hear if any of our speakers have questions for our other speakers. Perfect. I love seeing all of you all at once. It's like we're real. It's like we're in person, like a real panel. But yeah, do you guys have any questions for each other?
I'll go, if I may.
Of course.
Yeah, a question to Jessica. I guess, kind of interacting with data scientists, software engineers to be, you've mentioned that there's the silo that technology is neutral or exists in its own sphere. What kind of interesting thoughts or encouraging signs do you see interacting with your students?
So I think that I have lectured a few courses at the university, and mostly in kind of social sciences, and this would be my first for the last 3 years teaching and engaging with engineers. And I mean, I was incredibly surprised, right? And I think it's kind of the research that I had done before teaching engineers and interacting with them definitely, I definitely had a very particular opinion on the discipline, on kind of the systems and the way that it works. But I think that my students are exceptional and have very interesting ideas. And I think teaching them has definitely shown me like kind of the possibility for collaboration between the disciplines, right? And I think that's obviously why I'm quite specific about it being a multidisciplinary course, because whilst I try get them to understand systems, institutions, right? Because I think when we speak about racism or discrimination, it's not just always individual acts, it's kind of part of these larger institutions. They also teach me so much about how kind of different kinds of lateral thinking works, about how different kinds of technologies work. And I think my understanding of how data systems work is definitely a kind of a collaborative learning, teaching thing that I have from them. So I feel very positive. I definitely am not like a doomsday anti-technologist nostalgia for the good old days kind of person. And I think that they produce really interesting work. But I think that the thing that I have learned the most is that, young software engineers, young computer scientists don't necessarily understand society as a structure and the way that institutions work within society. And I think that is dangerous. I think that is really dangerous as they kind of design inputs into society to not understand that. Thanks, Jack.
Yes, and with that in mind, I sort of a follow-up question that comes from our Q&A from Liam Mullaney. Is there any way in which you can take something as subjective as justice and hard code it into an AI program, especially when considering that the data input within itself can be flawed? And so if anyone, Jessica, Jack, Dahlia, Navroop, if any of you have any thoughts on that, would love to hear it. Liam would especially love to hear it.
I can take that up, even though I'm probably the least qualified to respond to it. Definitely the least academically trained on that. But the short answer is no, because there are 2 to 3 layers that you have to look at simultaneously. The definition of justice would vary for one person, right? As you mentioned, that it's subjective. So that's what the question represents. Second is that it's context specific, as in you have to look at what system that you're analyzing justice in. What are the bounds of the system? What are the boundaries of that system, right? We often talk about that when we do client work around, building, designing systems. We do a lot of stuff around tokenomics, so it's like a mini economy, but sort of open and has some channels of interaction. And this is what justice means in practice. So there's theory and then there's practice. Now, what happens in practice is that there are trade-offs, right? So most of the economics students know about Pareto optimality. Now, I'm not going to pick archaic ideas, but that's usually where things stop when it comes to optimization. But in practice, you see not just trade-offs, but also different interest groups that are, fighting. An example would be Black Lives Matter, right? And you start to see this backlash saying all lives matter, but all the other lives are now being killed, right? And all the other lives are now being attacked and things. So just being able to nuance and be subtle about it. And this is almost this anti-intellectual movement around the world, which is probably the most dangerous of all. And so the short answer is it's hard. And the second part of your question is like how to code that into an AI program. The first thing is, the first biggest problem with the industry is something that's called security by obscurity, right? So hide things where how the algorithm works, how the security systems work are hidden behind closed walls. We don't know how the justice, is given to different, for example, prisoners and anyone who is brought to justice for that matter. Cybersecurity, prime example, right? Security by obscurity. Now the challenge with that is if you can't shine a light, it's almost like you need sunlight for it to be a disinfectant. You can't analyze the system, the algorithms that are producing those results, right? So it's the first necessity is to be able to parse through and see what's going on. So what we need is almost a new paradigm where the public scrutiny or the public security is actually much better than this private security by obscurity sort of paradigm that a lot of these deep learning and sort of AI algorithms are also using and perpetuating, right? So all of my experiences from working directly with clients and seeing what challenges that they face and why we lack the tooling and why we're still talking about it, right? Why we're not actually like building better systems. It's because of that paradigm, like put things behind sort of closed walls. So let me pause here. I'm sure others have more to add, but just a few insights from what I've learned.
Does anyone else have more they'd like to add? Especially, and jumping off this, we have another question related to this, which is, can we already estimate the impact of algorithm prejudgments? Do we have enough data? And so that's another question really relating to this, if anyone has a further comment.
Well, I guess it kind of depends on what you mean by impact. I can say that whether you're looking at impact as something that you want to kind of quantify into sort of particular data points that are measured against something, I can say, from my own experience, I do casework with precarious workers who work on apps as well as doing research. So I research, but I'm also actively involved in trying to, when the technology fails, which it does all the time, trying to walk workers through the process of appealing to, of trying to basically piece together something that looks like justice from scraps, right? And that process, I can tell you that the impact of that, I had just earlier today, a grown man, Uber driver with 6 children, has been working in minicab driving in London for 10 years. In London, the minicab sector and the Uber sector is an essential part of urban infrastructure. These were the workers that were helping NHS workers and care workers travel throughout the pandemic without having to take public transport. And he was in tears, right? He was like in tears because, the algorithm had flagged him as, sharing an account. He doesn't know why or how that happened. He hasn't been sharing accounts, and he was deactivated at the touch of a button. He had his livelihood taken away from him. And he's been trying to get Uber to speak to him for the past 6 weeks and has just been met with like automated messages. So, that is the impact of a model that seeks to accelerate and intensify the neoliberalization of work, where the worker is reduced to, I often say that, when we think about, there's basically Uber has been trying for a really long time to develop the technology to do driverless cars, right? After many, many failed attempts, they've basically given up on this idea. And I think whether or not you can actually do driverless cars is like not the question that's interesting to me. The question that's interesting to me is, what does it mean that the ultimate imagined goal for Uber is to have driverless cars, right? Their ultimate goal is to abolish the worker as a human being, right? And so where they can't actually literally do that, that is still the imaginary impulse that is guiding all of the measures that they implement. So where they can't automate, they merely dehumanize. So they merely treat the worker as if they are not a human, until they are able to actually have the worker not be a human. And I think that is, the kind of, Ruha Benjamin talks about how, the most dangerous place for a Black person is in the imagination of a white person. And I would say the most is in the imagination of white people. And I would say that the most dangerous place for an exploitable worker is in the imagination of a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. And I think that, looking at, can something as subjective as justice and hard-coded into an AI be hard-coded into an AI program? I think this is, again, where like a geographic perspective is really interesting, because, and picking up on what Jessica talks about thinking about AI and technology as something that is separable from, the public sphere or separable from society. It's not just about the code, or it's not just about the design. It's actually about what is the context in which these apps are actually operating. What are the urban institutions, what are the urban infrastructures, what are the social contexts. You know, when I talk about, you know, the casework that I do, oftentimes what we find is that, yes, there is obviously like frustration with operators, with, you know, with these apps, but there's also a sense that these apps rely on the failures and the gaps of particular institutions, whether it's, you know, regulators, whether it is the Home Office, which is, you know, our kind of immigration enforcing institution in the UK, whether it's police, they rely on the particular paradigms that these existing urban institutions have in order to kind of sometimes do their dirty work for them. And so it's not just about the kind of, can you code it into the AI program? It's actually about what is the function of this technology within a broader context, some of which is digitized and some of which isn't. And so I think that, you know, I don't think that when you think about like the rise of these platform companies, the reason they've risen in the way that they have is because we have this convergence of austerity and harshening immigration policy and rise of far-right rhetoric. And that is a convergence that is happening globally. And it's without that context, which we don't often think about as a technological thing, I would argue that the convergence, the conjuncture of those contexts, without that, the particular model of the platform economy would not exist in the way that it exists. That doesn't mean that it couldn't have existed differently. I'm definitely also not a sort of Luddite, you know, anti-technology regardless, but like that is the reality of like the political economy of the platforms that we are talking about.
Can I add something quickly?
Of course.
I also just, you know, think that we have this kind of novelty about how we respond, like how we respond to kind of this like discriminatory technology. But I mean, the algorithm is not a new invention, right? Like modes of categorizing and sorting and specifically like putting people, you know, as modes into certain categories to produce a desired outcome. I mean, the whole kind of project of apartheid was a very specific calculated algorithm, right? And so I think, I don't know if we have to kind of have this complete, you know, bewilderment on like, how do we respond to, you know, discriminatory technology when, you know, this kind of injustice has been responded to, right? Like social movements, like politics, justice, these new concepts. And I think that often we kind of sell ourselves short by really kind of leaning into this whole, you know, everything that is, you know, everything about Silicon Valley is so novel and it's new, and therefore it always needs new approaches. And like we need to be creative, we need to, you know, think differently. And Navroop, I am, you know, I really believe in the power of ideas before we build the society we want to, right? I think that thinking about it is very important. But I also don't think that we have to, you know, we're not starting from scratch in how we respond to these kind of discriminatory systems, because discriminatory systems, ways of categorizing people as data, have existed for a long time.
Yes. No, definitely. Definitely we've been categorizing people for a long part of history now, and just the categories change the way of categorizing. Now we have computers do it for us, and the computers unfortunately think like us. So with all of this in mind as well, you know, with these systemic issues being replicated, you know, sort of with these systemic issues being replicated because of the system that we live in, and sort of everything feeding within to each other, sort of what Jack said earlier about how you make tools, the tools shape you, and it just goes all around. Do any of you believe that tech justice can be achieved within the current system of startups, of venture capital funds, and are there, and keeping Navroop's points earlier in mind of building the world how you how you want it to be, are there any potential alternatives to these systems, such as one Q&A posed, as one question posed, platform cooperatives. So what do you all think of that question and potential alternatives to the current system of startups?
Just before that question does get answered, just a reminder that we've got about 5 minutes left of the session. The thing in the corner is incorrect.
I can take that up. Oh, so many initiatives I can quote. The answer is a resounding yes. Anything is possible if you can get enough people, money, resources behind it, other than when it comes to destroying the natural world, which is, of course, irreplaceable. Can we make companies steer towards a better, equitable world? Yes. Governments? Yes. Is it now? Is it easy? No. But basically that's what we're doing, right? On an everyday basis. That's exactly what we're trying to do. What's it going to take? The easiest way, or the most straightforward way, for the lack of a better term, is regulation, because companies have to comply. The challenge there is, of course, that a lot of the corporates work across borders, right? So you have like this interesting triangle where there's governments on one side, which are sovereign national governments. So that means they do not have jurisdiction over other sovereign countries. Then there's corporates that don't really have national boundaries. And then there's people. And the way for people to hold the companies accountable is to go through national regulation, because of they can let their desire be known through voting, right? And there's no way for people to hold corporates accountable other than direct action, which is a lot of what Dali and Jessica are talking about. And there's been newer sort of tooling, tagging on social media, naming and shaming, all of that, which, yeah. But there's no real way. You cannot legally, you can bring, of course, class action lawsuits and things like that. But you see, like when it comes to changing the trajectory, you have to go kind of through governments. Now, what we've seen over the past years, particularly in the US since the 1970s, is this erosion of the idea of governments as an enabler, right? Governments are seen as a problem. The problem is that governments are seen as a problem. You have these best innovations and that you're currently using because the government was able to take on the risk, take on their risk portfolio, put venture money into this. Elon Musk, gets quoted in every single discussion. I don't really see him as a hero. $500 million taxpayer, subsidies, incentives, grants, and that's why Tesla is on the streets, right? On the road. And people don't know that, like, humans have a problem with wanting to worship, like, certain sort of superheroes sort of thing. And that's why we make and create these. And that's really where, it's so important to study behavioral economics and cognitive sciences to kind of understand what kind of tool are you working with, which is your own mind. And yeah, so that's the first thing, right? And although I would say the newer instruments are changing within the industry, we are valuing bigger corporates, other startups massively to align with a certain paradigm. Then, of course, there are forums like the United Nations, WEF, and other places. Things move slowly. They've become sort of entire institutions in of themselves. But the answer is a yes. The path is not straightforward. You gotta do what you gotta do with whatever tools, access, networks you have. And I would say, yeah, don't ever doubt that it's not possible.
Well, thank you so much for what is going to be our concluding concluding statement of the session today. Thank you to all of our speakers for coming here virtually, of course. I appreciated all of the different perspectives you all brought, and unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all of the questions that we had. So for anyone in our audience who wants to continue discussing this, definitely stick around on the platform, have debates at the variety of tables. And yeah, thank you so much to each one of our speakers. You all brought something unique and amazing to this conversation. So just thank you. Yes, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you all
so much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.